Okay, welcome. Today we are going to talk about Abraham and Sarah and their journey to the Promised Land and some ideas about why the Lord led them to that particular place. So we're going to do share screen here, bring those slides up for you, and we can start journeying with them to the Promised Land. Okay, so Abraham and Sarah come originally from Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia being a wonderful Greek word that means between the rivers. So in this case, between the Euphrates and the Tigris. So Mesopotamia, between the rivers. They are from Ur of the Chaldees, which possibly is the very large historic city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, although some Old Testament scholars think there may have been another Ur up in this area closer to Haran. So they are either from lower Mesopotamia or upper Mesopotamia. In a way it doesn't matter because Mesopotamia is where writing was first developed around 3000 BC, 1,000 years before Abraham and Sarah. And shortly after that, writing was also developed in Egypt, which is where Abraham and Sarah's descendants will spend quite a bit of time later in history. Very interesting, the connections to both of these very, very significant historic centers of civilization. So, the living, we actually know from Genesis 11 and 12 that Abraham's father had actually begun the trip toward the Holy Land, but then they had settled in Haran. And then after some time, the Lord speaks to Abraham, and says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Genesis chapter 12. Okay, as they're journeying toward the Promised Land, this is what their caravan of households would have looked like, traveling with flocks of sheep and flocks of goats, usually mixed, also some herds of cattle, and going mostly on donkey back, although some on foot. That previous flock was mostly sheep, this is mostly goats, and you get the sense here of how the people would have been traveling. Now we know from the biblical record that they also had some camels. Although having been on a camel, I can tell you that if you're going across a long, dry desert, you need a camel. Other than that, forget the camel, just go on the donkey. Take my word for it. Okay, they're on their way to the Promised Land. As they travel, this is what their encampment would have looked like. A cluster of tents with their animals with them around the tents. They traveled about 8 to 10 miles per day. And from Haran to the Holy Land, it's about 400 miles. So you can see that was to be a long journey. They would have stopped every night, give the herds and the flocks some time to graze and to water. A little bit closer up, the archaeologists have reconstructed for us what their tent would have looked like as they traveled, and that is obviously a task to set up and take down every day. As they journeyed, eventually they came to Shechem in the Promised Land. It's the first recorded city where they stopped, and here they built an altar to the Lord in Shechem and began to pray, beginning to bring the knowledge of God into this land. This is the ancient city of Shechem, down here in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Old Testament Shechem appears about 50 times in the Old Testament, very significant historical site. By the time of Jesus, the name has shifted to Sychar. So when you read in John chapter 4 about Jesus at a well in Sychar, this is where he is, right here in Old Testament Shechem, now called Sychar, with Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, looking down on them with all of that history. City wall of Shechem, at time of Abraham and Sarah. You can see we have to go back down in space to go back in time. So that wall is about 4,000 years old. This is the modern city of Nablus, modern Palestinian city of Nablus, on the hillside here, but we are ignoring that. We are concentrating on ancient Shechem, 2000 BC, and this is where Abraham and Sarah would have entered right here through that city gate. So, okay. As they entered the land, they came in from the north. Shechem is about here, and then they spent most of their time here on that great Central Ridge Road in the highlands, which will factor into Israelite history later. So that gives you a good sense of their location. You should also notice the Jordan River is quite low in the valley here, flowing from the Sea of Galilee down through the Dead Sea. And the fact that it's low in the valley will also become relevant. So here is actually the Jordan, and this is significant. The Jordan does not play the role in the Holy Land that the Tigris and Euphrates play in Mesopotamia, or that the Nile River plays in Egypt. This becomes relevant later when, many years later, generations later, when Abraham and Sarah's descendants, the children of Israel, are coming back into the Promised Land, coming from Egypt. Moses makes some particular comments about the nature of the land of Palestine. The land that you are crossing to take possession of is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. And it's also not like the land of Mesopotamia from which Abraham and Sarah had come. Not like the land from which you came, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot. Probably a reference to foot-powered machinery in the Egypt that was able to pick up the water from the Nile and then gravity flow irrigation from there. Now, back to Moses. But the land that you are going to take possession of, the Holy Land, where Abraham and Sarah had first settled so long ago, it's a land of mountains and valleys. Gravity flow irrigation will not work in a land of mountains and valleys, okay? It's a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. So not irrigation that you can easily control, where you have a large river that's on the flatlands, easy to get the water up. Doesn't work that way, Moses says. Here you will learn to be dependent on the Lord. Be dependent on the rainfall. You cannot irrigate. They could not irrigate from the Jordan. We do today with electric pumps. They couldn't in that day. They were dependent on the rain. If you've ever tried farming, then you know where I'm going with this. Okay? When the hay is growing, when the crops are growing, you're praying for rain, praying for rain. As soon as the crops are ready, you're praying for the rain to stop and the sun to come out. You are dependent, and sometimes it's hard to wait. This is part of why they're in this land, Moses says. You will learn to depend upon the Lord, not just your own resources or your ability to irrigate. And here you can get a sense of what I said earlier, that it's brushy along the Jordan. It's just not inviting for irrigation, nor sufficient in many ways. Okay, one more thing here about location. We talked about you are dependent in that land, and they were there to learn dependence and humility in depending on the Lord. The other thing that you'll notice as you look at their location, here, this is a tremendous central location. And because Abraham and Sarah were situated here by the Lord, that's why the children of Israel then are living here after Moses leads them back from Egypt. This is why Jesus grows up here, and from here he sends out his 12 disciples with the message of the gospel. And it goes from there. Okay. So from that location, you can see it's a very direct run to Asia. It's to the east, to Africa, and to Egypt to the south, and then Paul and Barnabas north and west to Europe. So I think the Lord plants Abraham and Sarah here for reasons. First of all, to learn dependence upon Him for themselves and for their descendants, but also because it's such a central location to fulfill that promise of Genesis chapter 12, through you all nations will be blessed. And from there then the gospel goes out to all nations. So thank you for joining us.